Welcome to the next episode of the Entrepreneurial Excellence podcast. It is great to have Mark Heynen with me here today. So, Mark and I met in a really funny but super Silicon Valley way, where actually Mark was my landlord. And we got to know each other through that, ended up being lucky enough to invest in one of his companies, and sort of the rest is history. But one of the really cool things about Mark and why I wanted him to be on the show today is he is one of these sort of slightly unknown, and I hope you don't mind me saying that, Mark, unknown, low key in a really good way, founders who's done 4 different companies, worked at some of the top companies in Silicon Valley, always seems to be on trend. And it has so many experiences that I was like, I need to learn more from Mark. And your story is one that I think a lot of other people can learn and hopefully emulate as well. So thank you for being on the show.
Happy to be here.
So Mark, what I want to kick off with is an understanding of, this is the Entrepreneurial Excellence podcast. How do you define excellence as an entrepreneur? What does that mean to you? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a multi-dimensional question, but I think at its core, entrepreneurialism is about finding an interesting problem and rallying a whole bunch of people and capital to attack that problem and doing it well. And I think if you can do all 3 of those things, you're generally, going to do well as an entrepreneur. I think people dwell a lot on the finding a problem part of it. That is, I think, what most people in the world think of when they think of entrepreneurs. And I actually found in practice, the rallying people and capital behind the problem is actually the more challenging piece of it. And yeah, so I find that when we talk about entrepreneurial excellence, a lot of the discussion inevitably will revolve around that second piece. And then, of course, also doing it well.
And so walk me through then, how do you as a founder make sure you get those pieces right? Okay, so like that sounds like easy-ish. What do you do to make sure you can actually rally the people and go raise the money to go attack that problem? Like what are the key things you need to do?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that I've found over the course of my companies are really critical. And I have to say, some of these are hard won and hard learned from, making a lot of mistakes along the way.
Yeah, so that's why I want you on the podcast to tell us the mistakes we can avoid because you made.
Exactly. So one of the biggest challenges I found is, it's very easy when you're first starting to hire the people right around you or in front of you because it eases some pressure in terms of actually being able to attack a problem, right? And in the end, what happens when you do that is often you end up having to do a lot of the work yourself. And so, I had this experience in my first company. My first company was a company called Electrobug. I started when I was, 23, and I ended up having to hire folks around me in the UK and also in India on a very expedient basis to basically capture the demand that I was seeing in the marketplace. And in the end, especially when I was starting to incorporate in India, hired people in India, and some of the folks I hired there ended up not being up to the task and creating really significant problems for us. And that was actually a real challenge and something I had to learn a hard lesson from. On the flip side, and later on in a later startup, I really kept the team quite small and ended up keeping the bar extremely high for people coming in to the extent that I had to do a lot of the work for a longer period of time than I would have liked, but it ended up paying massive dividends. So I think that hiring bar is really important. And then I think on the flip side, there's this challenge where if you do hire, very qualified people, it's very easy to delegate and turn your brain off and not get so involved. And then all of a sudden you find something is not going the way you want and you need to jump in and figure out how to handle that. And I actually think that is another failure case, right? Where you don't have a system of keeping tabs on things and, allowing people to flourish and execute in their roles, but also making sure that things are on task. So I think those are actually some of the key challenge points for any growing company.
So a lot of questions from that. So first one, I'm going to try to make sure we get through all these ones because you brought a ton of points to it. So one, maybe just off the last point you made, right? Okay, well, you hire really talented people and then you kind of turn off your brain, you trust them, you delegate, which is arguably a good thing to do, right? You're handing the work to them. But you said that's a failure state in many cases. So what goes wrong? What doesn't work in that and why? Like where's the failure? And then how do you avoid that failure? Because you do want to hire great people and you want to trust them. So what went wrong with that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Dan Soroker made this point recently on an interview, and I really appreciate the way he put it. You're hiring people into the company at the senior leadership level, hoping to up-level the execution level of your company, because you're getting someone with maybe 10, 20 years doing something, let's say enterprise sales, and you want to have them bring that methodology. Ultimately, you really want to be able to have them run and attack a problem and delegate, like you say. I think fundamentally the question is, ultimately it's your company. You're going to be there for a long time. For a lot of people these days, even in a startup environment, average tenure is 2 to 4 years. And so ultimately people are inevitably going to bring their prior experiences with them, including the other environment they were operating in. And, there might be very specific things about the space you're in and about your product where you have unique insights. And so I think you can't just abdicate responsibility completely and then all of a sudden, when it's not the way it's supposed to be going, come in and try to fix it. That's sort of a failure state for a lot of people. And it's also not very motivating for the person who's trying to do their job. They might not be aware that they have a certain way of doing things that doesn't fit the mold of this new world. And so that's actually, I think the key is to just keep tabs and make sure that you're empowering people, but make sure you stay in the loop.
And so empowering people to stay in the loop. So you're saying like basically, what is that? A weekly check-in, a daily check-in, a metric that they're supposed to hit, and then you just want them to give updates. Like how do you like to get this done so you're getting the right level of updates without being annoying and kind of micromanaging?
Yeah. I do believe in high context. I believe that actually having tons of strategic context of what's happening in the company, a lot of transparency, that helps people make the right decisions. I find having regular, I do think one-on-ones are important, but I actually think having regular team meetings where you're attacking certain problems is important. And I think that really helps. One thing we did at PayJoy, which I think was very useful, is in our weekly management meeting, we made sure we spent 1.5 to 2 hours tackling the biggest issues and anyone could put an issue on the whiteboard and we can dig in deep on these issues. And we went deeper than just doing status updates around the room. And that allows everyone to see the strategic assumptions we're making, challenge each other on those assumptions and make sure we're on track. And I think that sort of strategic process really helps with making sure the people who are out trying to execute can make sure to recalibrate based on what's happening in the company.
And when you did that at PayJoy, was that setting up, like, was that in the greater context of like, here are my goals for the quarter and I'm trying to hit them? Like, did you have OKRs in place? Or was it just like, hey, like I have a challenge? Like, how do you create the environment to where people at senior levels are willing to come to the table with problems? Because sometimes that means, hey, are you messing up, right? People have fear of, even at a senior level, I find that people still have fears of making mistakes and they don't want to admit their mistakes. And so how do you get people to feel comfortable to bring those challenges to the table?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's really challenging. And I think this is about, I said, it's about, finding a problem, rallying people and capital behind it, and then doing it well. I think this is the doing it well piece. Ultimately, you really need to create that psychological safety where people feel comfortable being vulnerable and sharing that there's something they're unsure of. And even if the thought is not fully fleshed out, being comfortable putting it out there and having having the management team dissect it and give their different points of view. And that's really a cultural dynamic that I think the founders and the CEO has to set a tone for early on. And I think if you don't have that, you end up having things metastasize and get to a bad spot. And I think that's just a baseline, which I think is really challenging for a lot of people to do, but a really important thing. In every company I've worked in, we've had OKRs. I think that's something that provides a lot of strategic clarity, provides alignment. Some people, like to have OKRs they get 70% on. Some people want the 90% or the 100%. I think that's a matter of taste, but ultimately I think that drives alignment and clarity around the organization. But then of course, there's a lot about how you go about chasing those goals. And that's where that psychological safety, that supportive atmosphere is super important. And then I think the flip side of that supportive atmosphere is having a results-driven culture where you have clear outputs you're trying to hit and you hold each other accountable to those outputs. So people know that they're being held to account by the other people on the team.
What are the right consequences if people miss the goals that they've set? So obviously you can fire someone, but that sort of can be tough if people are all missing their numbers or something. Like what are the right ways to hold people to account to numbers that they've set?
It's so context dependent. Ultimately, in a lot of cases with, for example, go-to-market and sales, there might be more going on than, the individual performance of the individual person.
That's always the excuse for a salesperson. Hey, we didn't hit I was unable to sell because marketing wasn't doing its job.
Exactly.
Marketing says, our numbers would be great if sales only knew how to close.
Right. And then the market could be soft, right? So the market's soft, so I can't sell, right? Or capital's constrained, or if we only had this feature, engineering isn't delivering this feature is holding up all the sales. So there's always that challenge. I really like spaces where there's so much latent demand where a lot of that stuff gets washed away. And I think that's where picking the right space is really important, right? Where you make sure you're in a space that's growing quickly enough where you're not really fighting about whether you've closed 3 or 6 clients or closed 30 or 35 clients, right? That there's like a bigger trend going on. I think I would actually separate out the go-to-market and the technical side, right, of a business, especially a tech business. I've primarily been involved in tech businesses, right? So I think on the go-to-market side, I really feel a lot of the issues you might see in hitting goals, you can get an early read on. You can see the way things are going. You can see the natural momentum of the traction coming in the marketplace and whether you have the right people in place who can actually pick up that traction. I also think you can put frameworks together, especially in an enterprise sales case. There's a great framework called the Mentor that I worked together with some folks on at PayJoy, which is basically about having a framework for figuring out if the market is responding the way you think should be responding to what you're putting out there. And so you can actually get an early read and make sure you course correct before you get too far in, right? And so you're not in a situation where you've missed your numbers, you're 3 days from a board meeting and you have to figure out what to do. You really never want to be in that situation.
What's the high level of that? Is that making sure you're looking at numbers every day, every week, like your key metrics? Like what is the high level of how do you do that the right way?
I think you are not necessarily just looking at the numbers, but you're also looking at like how people are responding, how much inherent mandate there is to adopt what you're putting out there. And so with the framework, Bemanter, the M is mandate.
So
and mandate is really
BMANTR.
That's right. That's exactly it. Yeah, you can Google it. So budget, mandate, access to the right people, need, timing, and the R is escaping me right now. It'll probably come to me later. And so ultimately what that does, especially the M part of it, so the mandate really gives you a sense for whether there is a inherent desire or drive in the organization to solve the problem that you're focused on. R is risk, by the way. So the risk that things are not going to go the way you said. So it's a framework. I actually worked with a gentleman by the name of Charles Blanchett on developing this. He posted about it. People will find the post. It's a great post for early stage startups. I highly recommend it. And the key there is you're actually qualitatively evaluating your early deals, which is way beyond the numbers. It gives you a sort of a pulse check. It gives you a sense for whether things are moving in the right direction on deals, especially deals that might take 2 to 6 months to close, which is often the case when you're really starting something new. So, I think moving from Electrobug to, for example, Skycatch, which was the third company I started, which is a drone company. I was on the initial team of Skycatch, to be clear. There we were trying to close construction companies on flying drones over their projects to build 3D models. Yep. This is a brand new technology, something construction companies are generally not open to doing. And they were probably also wondering whether it's worthwhile to have, flying robots in the sky over their workers, all sorts of questions on their minds. And we had to, within a very short period of time, line up construction companies to use this service to allow us to grow the company, raise funding, provide validation for investors. We ended up actually closing the contractors who built the new Apple campus, AC2. And so we flew that on a daily basis. And that was a phenomenal close. But, getting to that stage required a lot of work where we had to figure out what is the actual natural need that this is serving and what is the mandate, sort of who has as part of their job something that we're going to significantly help, and how excited are they to actually do the risky thing of actually working with a startup and putting money at risk to make something happen. And going through that framework is really helpful because then first, I would say every founder should do this themselves to begin with. So they really are in the seat. And then as they bring on more go-to-market people, they can apply the same framework and figure out if people are naturally responding or if they're not. And of course, your mandate could be strong, but then there are other alternatives in the marketplace. So you got to figure out how what you're doing is unique. And as long as you're continually focusing on that, I would say it's a bit like, continually checking your blood pressure or your cholesterol. As a person, you're going to have an early warning if something is not going right, and you're going to be able to course correct.
And so if it's not going right, course correct. It's like a soft pivot, maybe a hard pivot or something to change direction.
That's right. Yeah. So you might find that there is actually something new happening and there's a new feature required, or there's alternative to doing the same thing they wanted to be doing. So a great example is Skycatch. We're flying drones every day, building 3D models every day of construction sites. Great use cases around safety, project tracking, measurement, surveying. What happened while that was happening is we had LiDAR systems getting cheaper and cheaper, which also provided reality capture options. And then we had people putting cameras on helmets and walking around, which provided an alternative. So your competitive landscape changed pretty quickly.
Mhm.
And at the same time, we actually had compute evolved so much that they could actually process more data. And so we realized very quickly that actually it wasn't necessarily just doing the reality capture itself wasn't the unique thing. It was actually being able to do it on a very regular basis, hourly if required, without any incremental cost. Once you have the hardware on site, doing an hourly drone flight is not actually a problem. And the compute is available, cloud compute is available. So, and that obviously was better than all of the other options that people had. So that gives you a sense for how you can get an early read on what might be
Yeah.
changing.
And then going back to the point you made about your team, right? And hiring a great team and hiring really good people, and that mistake you made about hiring a lot of people instead of the right people. How do companies like avoid that error? Because I've definitely seen it myself. Like it's really easy to say, like, I just want to get people like butts in the seats, get them to do the work. I know it's expensive, but in the sense if they fail, I know it's expensive. But it's also really painful sometimes just to continue doing that work nonstop yourself until you really find someone who's great, because it feels like it's a massive delay. So how do you convince yourself it's worth the time of holding off to get those right people, especially if you're a startup and you're like trying to move fast, or you only have 18 months of runway. And if it takes you 9 months to find the right person, and then it takes them 3 months to spin up, you don't even have time left before you got to do your next fundraiser, you go broke.
It's really hard. I have to be honest that people have to go through it once or twice. They have to have made the wrong decision or like lowered the bar at certain points or done the expedient thing. And then they have to feel that painful process of trying to, manage someone out or try to go through and actually do a lot of the work that you were expecting to have done. And you realize that it's just not worth it at that point. I also think there's something about doing the work yourself for longer than you might want to, because you actually build a more intimate relationship with the work, whether it's on the go-to-market side or on the product side, or even on the engineering side. In all the cases that I've been involved in, having the founding team actively involved really helped. And I think a great example in the PayJoy case, so PayJoy is my most recent company, well, my second most recent company. So fintech that focused on device financing with a lock that basically locks the phone if someone doesn't pay, so it creates digital collateral. Doug, my co-founder, built the first lock and was heavily involved in building that lock for a while in the initial stage of the company. He was intimately aware of what was possible, not possible. Now, of course, there were a lot of other very qualified engineers we brought in fairly quickly in 2015 when we brought that on. But having that level of knowledge of what is and is not possible was really important when we were talking to investors and trying to convince them that actually this idea of actually creating digital collateral on a smartphone is something that'll scale. That's something that I think investors love to question. And, I think you are probably quite aware. Investors often have technical backgrounds these days in Silicon Valley and can get very deep. And if they are deeper than the founder in the founder's business, that's a warning sign generally.
Huge ones.
And so I would say that really helps. And so there's a side effect of waiting to get the right person involved. And that is you end up building a lot more intimacy with your problem and intimacy with the product and the go-to-market motion.
And so, but then walk me back to like push back when you mentioned like the initial issue that you had with this exact issue with Electrobug, right? Oh, it sounds like a lot of those roles were maybe not like critical higher end roles, but maybe more junior roles. So like, can you take, how much should you keep the same level of quality in time to even hire more junior roles? Or can you put people on a little bit more of like a preliminary hire? Like, hey, you're a preliminary hire. We're going to take 1 or 2 months, so you can get the job done, and then make you more like officially full-time or part of the team. Or every role should just be, we're only hiring top tier people, no matter what, no matter how long it takes. And we're just going to keep our level really high. Like, can you break things out that way? Or is that a failure state if you try to?
Yeah, I think this is just a challenge I think every startup has, which is how do you actually maintain a certain level or a certain culture as you grow. And I do remember in the 90s, I was doing corporate research for a company called the Corporate Executive Board. And we actually interviewed someone from Intel, the head of strategy at Intel. And this head of strategy was talking about how viruses can grow within the company. And she'd seen it firsthand at Intel, where you basically hire a certain group of people that have a different culture, and then they hire other people. And all of a sudden you have a virus, you have a different team with different set of cultures, different priorities. And I remember thinking that's such a visual image, but I had such trouble thinking that really happened in real life. But now that I've been through this, I could definitely see that happening. So I think this is generally just a challenge for any growing company. I do think if we're talking about startups in the first 100 people, I think it is fairly important that the CEO get involved in spending time with each of those 100 people as they come in. Now, people have different ideas of whether it's the first interview or the last interview, but I do think that that is actually quite important to avoid a situation where you have culture drift. And then, of course, you want to make sure you have a certain hiring bar. I think that is one powerful way to avoid this happening.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you mentioned also, of course, like the culture and keeping an open culture and having that coming from the founding team. So I want to take that point and bring it back to one of the first questions I asked right around, like, what does excellence look like? But then as part of it, what does success mean, right? When you think through yourself as a 4-time founder, what is success? How do you define success? Is it financial? Is it leaving a legacy? Like what is success to you, and what is success to a lot of the other founders that you've had a chance to work with and for?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty personal question. I think you'll probably hear different things from everyone you ask on this, and so I'd be really curious if you ask other people as you go.
I ask everyone, so I'll tell you how your answer aligns.
That's fantastic. I personally think success is building something with duration, something lasting, something that actually can stand the test of time, something that can last beyond the founding team, beyond certain market conditions, beyond one particular technical trend. I think that is success. And I think there are two different aspects to that. I think one aspect is that you are building something that clearly is serving a fundamental need, which I think is important. I think the second is that you're building something that can sustain sort of, a lot of different waves out there, and, be something that employees and others can really attach themselves to over a longer period of time. And I think that's really critical. And I'm quite proud that, the companies that I've built have, generally focused on those principles.
And when you build them, has that been part of your underlying thesis for building them in the first place? Is like that's been your goal? Because one of the things that really has impressed me when reviewing your background before this call is like you've been on trend in so many interesting ways, right? I mean, you're outsourcing to India way before outsourcing even became a thing. You were, doing fintech before it was a thing. You're frankly, like, we should talk more about, like, you were at Google really early. You were at Facebook really early, like two of the most iconic companies that are out there. You did crypto before it was really a thing. And now you're on to AI. Like, what has been the driving factor for you to sort of be on trend, but also hit those metrics that you would define as success?
Yeah, for me, the first thing about being on trend is really constantly talking to people about what's happening and how consumer behavior is changing, how people's behavior is changing, what underlying technical trends are happening. I think I'm just a voracious consumer of, blogs, books, and I just talk to people constantly about what's happening. And I think that ends up being a big determinant of that first thing I mentioned about finding something that is a big problem and being able to attach yourself to a big problem.
So are you sitting down? Are you like reaching out to people on a daily basis, like sitting down, reaching out, like, let's grab a coffee, let's do this, or just like on the top of that reading, once again, like a bunch of books on different topics? It's just like your pastime. Like, is your hobby sort of, I want to keep learning? Like, what would you define that as?
Yeah, I would define it as reading voraciously. I would say more blogs than books. I will say, like, even when
That's kind of, I think, the trend for a lot of people.
Yeah. Big user of Google Reader back in the day, and those kinds of tools, right?
R.I.P. Me too.
Back in the day. And then I would also say there's just something about reflecting a bit about where things are going. And, ultimately, I just love staying in touch with founders and staying in touch with people who are trying new things and seeing, what's working, what's not. And, I've actually been advising companies really since 2000, when I was like one of the only entrepreneurs in my friend group in London. Most of my friends in London were wondering what the hell I was doing trying to start a company. Why didn't I just get a job in consulting like everyone else, right? And I really felt like a fish out of water. But one benefit there is I actually was able to interact with a lot of founders, a really high concentration of founders in London at the time. And then even when I came to the Bay Area in 2006, when I started at Google after I'd sold my company, I ended up, even while at Google, interacting with a lot of early stage companies because I was working on platforms. I worked on the launch of Android. I worked with a lot of founders who were trying to launch new apps onto Android. And that's how I came across Facebook. I did the deal that helped us get Facebook onto Android, which was a
Wow.
bit of a long shot at the time.
Is that how you end up? Is that how you ended up at Facebook then too? You got to know their team and they recruited you over there or something?
That's how I got to know the team, right? And I remember quite vividly, there was an article in TechCrunch at the time, which was like, no effing way will we put Facebook on Android. That was like an official pronouncement, right? And so that, to me, that was a challenge. I had to make it happen one way or another. So ultimately, I think that interaction with that group of people was one thing that allowed me to just constantly see where things were going. And it's funny you say I'm on trend because we were chatting about this a little bit beforehand. I feel like I'm a little late, right? I felt like there was a lot of validation happening. And, you were like you talked about, we got to know each other because you were my tenant. One of my other tenants before you, the gentleman by the name of Phil Ryu, in 2013, we were just grabbing some food outside of my apartment, that he was renting. And he's like, look, I've got two things you need to know, Mark. You need to know that you should buy Bitcoin. You should try the Oculus. Do that and you'll be fine. And both of them seemed super sketchy to me at the time, right? But I did do both those things and I'm really glad I did. And I think that's just like a microcosm of like the benefit of, being around a high concentration of entrepreneurial people who are really like pushing the envelope.
Or maybe the magic is you just got to stay close to people who are your tenants in Cole Street in San Francisco.
So, it's been fantastic. It's been such like a nonstop source of inspiration for me.
That sounds like a magical apartment. I'm glad I got lucky enough to live. It was, by the way, to everyone listening, it was a magical apartment in the famous Haight-Ashbury. So that sense it was magical, but it sounds like it's also a magical place to be on trend. And so going back like even to Electrobug, right? Like what made you be that guy who come from Amherst, you do great at school, probably fairly like straightforward background. What made you go to London? You don't have a British accent, so I'm guessing you're not British. Go to London and then be a fish out of water and start a company, which still isn't really a thing in the UK in a big way. Why do all that and then continue? You've now done it for your entire career pretty much. Like, but what was it pushing you in that direction to become an entrepreneur?
So I personally just have this inherent restlessness. So when something becomes too routine or predictable, I feel restless and I feel like I want to do something different. I was doing consulting for 2 years in, DC, and I decided I really wanted to switch things up massively. And I am German, so I'm able to live in London. So I said, I'm just going to move to London, try to find a job, see what happens. So I did find a job in London. I got hired by a retailer. You combine sort of Best Buy and Home Depot, you put in Europe. That's the retailer I worked for. And the FTSE 100 company, the chairman brought me into his office the first day and asked me, what is the internet and how do I buy it? This is in 1998.
Wow.
And I told him, you probably can't buy it. And he said, well, I know the Americans are behind it somehow. I want to figure out how to buy it. And so I went on this great journey where they had a McKinsey study on how to actually, do e-commerce at the time, 1998, 1999, and came to the Bay Area, met the folks from eBay and Netscape and Excite, which was a thing at the time. And that really also instilled in me this other restlessness, which is like, wow, there's something really big happening here. I need to get on it. And actually through a problem we were having, which is that we couldn't get access to online prices in a reliable way. There was no Nielsen for online prices. I realized this is a business opportunity. So I created a company that effectively did that, raised money in 2000 before the crash, and created a company that provided Nielsen for online prices. And, hired a bunch of people in the UK, ran out of money, had to let go of a bunch of people in the UK because we ran out of money, and then flew to India and set up the company in India, and then grew that team to 200, 2 people in London, 200 people in India with clients in 18 countries. And I think that experience in itself was grueling. And also, it was so grueling that people were wondering why I was doing it, but it also fed a sort of inner restlessness I had to really push the boundaries a little bit. And I think we were talking about this before. Outsourcing was definitely a new thing at the time, right? And I wasn't really outsourcing. I was the director of a company in India. I spent 3 months a year in India. But, actually understanding the mechanics of setting up a big remote team, using MSN Messenger to interact with that team. There was no Slack at the time. There's no video calls. Trusting the people there to do a great job with the right guardrails, like we were talking about. It was fantastic. And the people I hired there, by the way, it's really amazing to see their progress one of the folks there, Krishna Mohan, is now leading the team at Global Logic, which runs Apple and Uber's outsourcing teams.
Wow.
And he was one of the first 4 people I hired. And so seeing the progression of those individuals is the other thing that gives me tremendous satisfaction and makes me excited to be part of startups and growing companies.
And so like, what was it like though hiring? I mean, so why did you end up choosing at that time India? Are there any lessons learned today? Given that now it's we're so much more of a globalized world. Like, are there lessons learned that you still apply to your current companies today? We're like, hey, you can hire a global team, or it was like, like it's really tough. Maybe you shouldn't do it for your first 100 people. Hire globally. Like, how did you take the lessons you learned at Electrobug and apply those to companies you advise or you started more recently?
Well, at the time, the place I set up a shop in India was called Gurgaon, still is called Gurgaon. It's a farming community, and they were just starting to recruit people to set up shop there. And
why even there? Like going, I feel like going to India would already be difficult, and then you choose a place that is not like the main tech hub.
Yeah. So my co-founder was Indian. He was from that region, so that made things a lot easier. And I have to give him a lot of credit here. He went out there and found this region that had a major incentive program, tax benefits, and he helped us set up there, which was really important. And that was really the main reason why we ended up doing that.
Yeah. Okay. And then would you advise companies today to do something similar? What is like pros and cons? Like there's some companies who want to do hybrid. There's some companies who want everyone back in the office nowadays. There's some companies who are remote first or remote only. What's your advice today?
I think we're in a very interesting time right now where, I became this expert at Indian outsourcing. I helped Google set up a team in India as well when I joined Google. And I think these teams are fantastic, but I also think the expertise that was in India at the time is now much more diffuse. It's available in Brazil, it's available in Vietnam, it's available in a lot more places. I think we're in a really interesting time, especially because of AI, where I can imagine a situation where you have more startups actually using teams in these countries across a lot of functions, and then actually having a much smaller footprint in the high cost areas, whether it's San Francisco, New York, or wherever you want to base the management team. And that is because the tools for collaboration have gotten so much better. The level of expertise you can find is really quite phenomenal. I worked while I was at SDF Stellar. I worked with a company called Cheesecake Labs, which has incredibly sophisticated engineers based out of Brazil. And I think that is a capability that just was not available before. And I also think it means you can just do a lot more as a startup with less capital. So you can actually make a lot more progress. And I think that means that there's just going to be just a lot more options available to founders these days.
Yeah, no, I would agree on that front. I think companies that don't take advantage of the global talent pool, if you're a tech company, you don't need people to be local, are ones that are going to miss out and probably be held back in a pretty big way. So just really briefly, like walk through okay, maybe kind of a bunch of other questions to go from this, but so you go to Electrobug, then you sell that, you end up going to Google. I don't know, there must have been maybe 1,000, 2,000 people at Google at the time. Then you end up at Facebook, probably the same number of people at Facebook, maybe less even when you join. How did all those things work? What was that like? What lessons did you see from those companies, especially the iconic ones, right? What did they get right? Or were they just lucky in riding this wave where they just, Google was the 10th or 12th or 15th search engine that came out, and yet it's the one that everyone remembers nowadays? What do these companies either get right or wrong? What do their founders get right or wrong? Are there things you would emulate or ignore from their lessons? And then how did that turn into your other startups as well?
I think starting at Google in 2006, after 7 years doing my own company, I bought it to profitability, made it cash positive, but it was a grueling slog to get there, to be really clear, right? This is a subscription-based market research business, not really a business that has natural momentum to grow exponentially, right? So when I joined Google, I was really shocked, first of all, at how much space there was for people to innovate and experiment, right? Which
nice when you have kind of unlimited profit. That helps.
Yes, of course, that helps. And then I think also just this point I made about how they were able to assemble through a culture of excellence, but also a culture of encouragement. They were able to have people, basically attack really hard problems and collaborate in a very meaningful way to attack those hard problems. And I think that culture is something that is really hard to create. And it's really important to be in that culture to be able to identify it. I don't think that means that culture is only ever going to happen at Google, to be clear. And, you could argue whether that culture is still happening right now at the current iteration of Google. But I actually think it was a very unique thing that was helpful for me to understand what it takes to actually build products that push the boundaries, because you need to have a lot of room to fail. You need to actually have, get the right people in the room to have them be able to attack those problems. And I very specifically remember, as an example, the rollout of this project called Ground Truth, which is really to have Google build its own maps. That's a great example where this is a very ambitious project where they were effectively going to discontinue their licensing agreements with Navtech and TeleAtlas, where they were licensing all their data. And the competitive environment meant they had to do that. And it's a very significant effort to be able to map all roads in the US within a very constrained period of time on your own and then switch over, right?
I think people forget how, it's ubiquitous now, but that is a massive problem to map the world's roads.
And this was Google that had much less resources than it does now, much smaller team. I think the team that worked on this was maybe 30, 40 people in total. Of course, they had drivers as well. They were using the Street View cars. That's generally how they were doing it. And so I think that is an example of, once you see that in action, you see it pull off, it really gives you a sense of what's possible with a small group of people being very driven. Moving to Facebook, I would say there was much more of a bias to growth, which I think people are aware of with Facebook. So much more of a focus on driving the metrics to basically getting onto more devices and getting Facebook everywhere.
Why was that different than what Google was up to? Is Google it was such a clear monopoly win almost right off the bat that they didn't need to have that same focus on growth, or just a different mentality of like leadership? Well, what would
I would say my impression, my experience at Google was they made a few big strategic moves that propelled growth. Of course, they had some execution excellence as well to make sure it worked. But I would say, obviously, rolling out search and the subsections of search, acquiring YouTube, rolling out Android. These are big bets. Rolling out Chrome. These are big bets that put them on a certain path, right? That is very bumpy, but they're doing the chess moves that get them in the right spot, right? I would say with Facebook, obviously they did also do strategic acquisitions later on as well. But in those initial stages in 2010, when I was there was very much a focus on just bias to action and making sure we execute, and actually, continue to grow on an incremental basis. And I think there was definitely also a bias to experimenting, but I would also say there was a lot of interest in, making sure when we roll out, we're actually measuring what's happening. And there was a culture of measurement, which I would say did not necessarily exist as much at Google. And that culture of measurement drove a lot of behavior, both good and bad, I would say, right? Like the focus on engagement, you could argue, it drove some bad habits within Facebook. At the same time, it also made sure that people were very focused on making sure we have product market fit in everything we do and rapidly discontinuing things that were not working. I do remember there was one project that launched and was discontinued within 4 weeks. And I was reflecting that at Google, that would not have happened, right? They would have let it go for maybe a year or two, and then maybe it would have retired to labs. But, having the discipline of saying, we've looked at the numbers, didn't work, let's move on. No fault of yours. You can just work on something else now. I think that's actually really impressive.
Which one of those cultures, I mean, they both obviously incredibly successful. Which one do you take away from more that you can emulate in more depth at your own companies?
Yeah, I've reflected on this a lot, and I honestly struggle with it. I think I personally find the Google culture fits my personality more. I am naturally reflective, and I like to reflect on what big moves will happen in the future and how we should position ourselves well within that and set ourselves up for, being able to be in the right space and then experimenting a lot within that. I love metrics. I love having dashboards where we have a clear KPI. I love having those KPIs. Of course, Google had revenue and other KPIs like that. I think focusing too much of those KPIs, you could have second order effects, which I think is one thing that might have happened at Facebook, which is excessive focus on engagement and growth led to not seeing the big picture. And I think one thing that Google had been able to do at the time was see the big picture. Which
although wasn't Google famously known, or at least Marissa Mayer was famously known for like spending weeks or months on a project to like find the right shade of blue or something?
Absolutely. And yes, Marissa's organization was very focused on A/B testing and having, I have a friend who's a product manager. Before he went to his, product reviews with Marissa, he would have a deck with 40 slides. They're just permutations of the same slide deck. And depending on how the conversation goes, you flip to the right one to know which way to go to basically get the thing done, because it basically fit different narratives based on what's happening, right? And I think, yes, I think that particular organization was much more metric oriented. That's definitely true. Obviously, things changed over time.
Of course. When you think through what's in those companies and like what those founders did, and also what's in the ones you built yourself, what do you think drives the best entrepreneurs? Like what drove Mark? What drove Sergey and Larry? What sort of drives you and your Doug, your co-founders? Like competition, ego, the drive to build something new that doesn't exist in the world. Like what is the underlying thing? Especially when founders hit maybe a level of financial security. So it's probably not about the money anymore, right? Elon Musk is still, of course, striving and building new things every single day, even though he's the world's richest man. Like, what was pushing those people, and what pushes a lot of the folks you've worked with?
It definitely varies. I would say that, let me talk a little bit about PayJoy and then my most recent company, Nap. So in the case of PayJoy, me, Doug, and Gib started in 2015. And I think we were all aligned that in that situation, we realized that there was this unique situation where the smartphone can actually provide more financial access than anything else. And that is, I guess, a deeper motivation than just building a company and having a company that's successful, whether that's, the financial motivation or the ego motivation of that. And Doug in particular had that experience of having lived in Africa and having created Pay-As-You-Go Solar and seeing what Pay-As-You-Go Solar did for people. And I personally had spent all this time in India, and Gib had also traveled quite widely and seen this firsthand. So I think that motivation was quite unique because we realized, okay, look, we know this might be a really hard slog. It's a long shot, digitally locking a phone is scary for a lot of people, and this might not work, but we're all going to take a bet on this because if it does work, it's going to be absolutely incredible. And I think that really sustained us through those first 2 years, which were quite challenging. We started in the US. The US didn't work as expected. We then went to Mexico. Mexico worked very well, but there were a lot of ups and downs in that first fragile part of the company. So I think that having a motivation like that is important. I think when it comes to Nap, so Cooper and I are working on it. Cooper was the former tech lead for the lock at PayJoy, and we are now working together on this new company, which is all about bringing AI to the workplace in a safe and easy way. I think there's a bit of the observation that a lot of people are not allowed to use AI at work, and so we want to come up with a way to solve that. And I think that'll make people more productive. So I think seeing that you can actually have a big effect on people's day-to-day lives is, I think, very motivational in terms of building something sustaining. I also think in the case of AI, I think there's something else going on here, which is, I think there's this fundamental shift happening, not only in how people are going to work going forwards, but also how companies are going to be organized going forwards. And I think it's quite important to design an organization and design products to match that new reality and not be stuck in the old reality. And I think as we started digging into this, we did a lot of deep brainstorming discussions, spent a lot of time with people from UCSF and banks like Citibank and other places, asking how they use AI, what their thinking is. And you very quickly realize that, ultimately we're really just starting on this journey. And to actually deliver the products that people want, companies are going to have to fundamentally look different than they are now. And so I think one motivation that we have at Nap is that we can actually just sort of start from scratch here and do things in the way that is well suited to the market right now. And I think that's very exciting. And also Cooper and I love working together. And I think that personal dynamic is super important as well.
I don't want to talk too much about AI because it's too easy to do and it's all over the news, but like without giving away secrets about what you're doing at Nap, but like what are those, how does AI going to change at a sort of a high level, how companies are organized, how they're built, how entrepreneurs achieve excellence and success? Like, what does that mean with AI, or like, how is the world changing? Because I think a lot of people would argue AI is sort of the same way, like the internet and then the mobile phone, and then AI is the next sort of like big generational change agent. What is that going to look like for the world of work or of being an entrepreneur?
So I think one big dynamic is going to be that you are going to be a lot more productive. A lot of the things that you generally have to spend a lot of time doing, you can do in a much shorter period of time. I think, people weigh the pros and cons of whether there are agents in the world. So whether it's going to actually be an agent or something else, I think we're, 5 or 10 years from now, I don't think we're going to be reading and answering emails one by one anymore, right? I think we're going to be orchestrating between different things that are trying to do different things on your behalf.
Yeah. Well,
And
our AI will be sending emails on our behalf and answering emails on our behalf. Basically.
Exactly. All the AI bots will be emailing each other and having a blast, and they'll be forwarding those random threads as well to each other, right?
They'll probably be joking about us behind our back on top of it.
Exactly. So yeah, you'll have a bot social media platform. Yeah. So I think what I would say is that you're probably just fundamentally going to be in a different mode, both as a founder, and I think your frontline workers at companies will probably be heavily empowered by AI on their devices. And those devices may not even end up being a computer, right? We don't know what those devices will look like. But ultimately, I think there'll be much more there'll be more high order decision making happening within the management teams of these companies. I think the companies will be more lean. There's no way around it because a lot of stuff will be automated. There's no question that will happen. It is scary. And so we don't know how that's going to pan out. And then I also think
it's scary that companies will be leaner, but does that lead to maybe more company creation? Like more people can become an entrepreneur because of it? Like, is that maybe the positive side of it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I definitely believe that we're going to have new job types created. And in the end, we're going to actually there's going to be a transition period, just like when industrialization switched over to the service economy. There's just a transition period you have to go through. I think in the end, people are resourceful and we're going to find ways for people to be productive in this time. I think that transition will probably feel scary and messy for a lot of people, but I think we are going to make our way through it.
So going back to sort of the question stuff, the main focus for podcasts, like when you think through the level of discipline, focus, sort of just routine that are important for a founder to be successful, what do you see or what do you practice yourself? Right? You're a 4-time founder. You're obviously you are actually pretty good at it. You certainly think you're good at it, but you are actually pretty good at it. What are those things? What does your routine look like? What is the discipline that it takes to be good at this? Since a lot of people just aren't made to be a founder. So what are the things you think you have that differentiate you from all of your friends back in the London days, but in plenty of your friends nowadays, even though you're in Silicon Valley and most of your friends probably are entrepreneurs, there's some level of differentiation. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, one thing a mentor of mine said early on, I think this was around 2012, 2013, is in an early stage, companies are very fragile. And there's so many situations where they can break. And not having that happen is really a byproduct, not only of making the right decisions, but also just continuing to persist, right? And I think I would say one thing that I found has really helped me is having that persistence and that grit of actually making your way through when things look like they, might be going off the rails or there's a significant challenge. I think that has been helpful. And I can think of a number of situations where we found our way through a really difficult situation.
Did you find that a lot of people give up? Did you find yes, you guys persisted and had that grit? Do you find that you've had a lot of other friends who've given up too early and you'd be like, man, they could have built something great? So is the alternative also true that if you don't stick around, you don't have that chance? And have you seen that occur in reality?
Absolutely. And I think there are probably a lot of startups that you will never hear about, even though they could have been successful because people gave up a little too early. Of course, there's the converse. People sometimes hold on too long and don't pivot away. But I think part of being persistent is to read the tea leaves and figure out how to make a change rather than just giving up the idea completely, right? And so how do you pivot into something new? Great example was at PayJoy, we started in the US. The US was not responding to our offer as we expected. We had to figure out what to do. We'd invested heavily in expanding across the US. And we decided to, fly to Mexico and try to grow in Mexico. Felt like a really big bet. We had only a few contacts in Mexico, had some partners who were helping us out. But ultimately, doing that slight shift really made the difference between PayJoy not being successful and PayJoy being successful. And at the time, it felt like, we were sort of going against the grain by trying to launch a new startup within the first year in a second country. That's something that a lot of people say you shouldn't do. So I think that is figuring out how to course correct, I think, is important.
I've heard a lot of people actually say too, from the grit perspective, that the way you should shut down your company is when you no longer have ideas of what to try. If you run out of
Mm.
ideas for what to try to get you to that next level, then either then maybe there are no more ideas and it's just time to shut it down, or you don't have the right, you're not in the right mental space to continue pushing it forward.
Mm. That makes a lot of sense. That resonates.
When you think through like the performance levels of the really good entrepreneurs versus like great entrepreneurs, how do you define that, right? Is it like level of work? Like, are you someone who's just working nonstop, or is it you have a really healthy balance? Like, what are the things where you think through yourself plus all your friends that would differentiate the great entrepreneurs from the only good, or people who just aren't entrepreneurs? Is there a difference?
Yeah, I think going back to sort of the initial framework I had about like choosing the right problem and then motivating people and capital behind that and doing it well. So in terms of choosing the right problem, that's I think a really important thing to dwell on, because ultimately people sometimes just focus on a problem they personally are having, which I know a lot of people at Y Combinator suggest you do that, right? Which I think is good as a starting point. If it's not a big problem or doesn't take advantage of some fundamental technical shift happening in the world, you're going to end up in a situation where you're going to have a narrow universe of possible successes, right? I think when you deal with a big problem, you choose a really big problem that's widely shared. You can screw up a lot of times and still be in good shape because there's so many different ways for you to win. And so I find the really great entrepreneurs do a lot of reflection early on to make sure they're solving the right problem. And also they listen closely when someone says they might not be solving the right problem, right? Which is, it's really easy to get defensive if you have conviction on something. I guess in terms of rallying the people and capital behind that problem, I think the best founders I've interacted with are excellent listeners and excellent communicators. And this is something that is, I think, generally undervalued. I think more recently people have talked more about this, and maybe because of podcasting, people are realizing there might be a benefit to communicating. But ultimately, and I wouldn't say I'm great at communicating, by the way. The people I am thinking of are just amazing at this, right? And if they're not amazing, they make it their job to be amazing at it. I do have this funny story where, and some people might have already talked about this elsewhere. Mark Zuckerberg came to Google to talk about Facebook in like 2008, 2009, some one of those interviewing years before sort of a Cold War broke out between the two.
Yep.
And he gave a speech, and people generally were just floored that this person could lead a company because they could not understand anything he said. He muttered, he was not clear. The thoughts didn't seem well structured, and it was so different from what they were used to hearing, right? Because I think Larry and Sergey are both quite clear, and then of course at that time they had a lot of other very great amazing communicators. Alan Eustace, even Vic Padotra was a good communicator, and so ultimately it really floored people. And so when I said I was moving to Facebook, they were amazed.
Yeah, I'm sure people are like, "Wait, you're going to work with that guy?"
Yeah, exactly. And what I really appreciated the first week I was there, it was actually the week there was a big privacy scandal in 2010, and Mark had an all hands, and he really held his own in that all hands. He was very authentic about what was going on. He had a good view and a very clear view on what we should do next and how this will all pan out. He ended up being 100% correct about how it would all pan out. And I was really struck about how it was very clear he had made it his mission to solve that communication problem and, get really good at it. And I think this is quite well documented that he's actually really focused on that. And I think that is actually a core skill. And I can think of other instances where, more recently, I would say at PageWay, I ran a team of about 12 people who were in other countries, growing PageWay in other countries. And so I would be on video calls, and this is before COVID. So it was quite rare to have your whole team on video calls. But we were basically trying to assess ways to break into new markets over a video call. And it was rough. It was really difficult to, go from 0 to 1 in these new markets, and trying to motivate people over a video call when they were challenged is a really difficult thing to do. And frankly, there are some people on my team who were even better at it than, I was. And I really acknowledge that they did a great job there.
So is your point though, like for you being a founder, is I'm going to go focus on like the biggest problem at hand and get really good at it? Or is like, I just need to be a great communicator? And that's what something like, how did you how do you teach yourself these things? And then yes, you can be disciplined, but what's the level of like focus on top of it that you try to accomplish to get there? Like what does it really take to get there?
Yeah, it has to be both. You have to be like solving the right problem to motivate people, but then I think you do have to communicate well. And you mentioned focus. I think that plays a big role to not be too scattered across too many things, but actually really dig deep and try to focus on solving this one thing at a time and building momentum around that one thing. I think that also plays a really significant role.
How do you like to structure your days as an entrepreneur? Like what is a sort of normal schedule for you?
Yeah, it really varies a little bit by stage of the company, but let's talk about the very early stage because I think that's really the most interesting, right? Where you're really trying to understand a market and try to bring something to market. And that's really where we are with Nap and with Knapsack as we're really assessing the market. I find, first of all, one really important thing is to always be in touch with your prospective customers
Mm.
and your potential users and talk them through what you're thinking and talk them through, maybe show them a prototype as early as possible and get their reactions. And so I have at least 2 meetings a day with people who are potential users of the tool, even before the tool exists, right? Where I can show them Figmas or something like that. And, I'm the non-technical co-founder, the business co-founder, the go-to-market co-founder. It's really important for me to be a voice of authority on, what people are thinking and how they react. I think the second piece of it is to have at least once a week an extensive session. Like I was mentioning, we did a PageJoy of like 2 to 3 hours where you're digging deep into big things that you need to solve. So big thorny problems that you need to resolve, technical architecture decisions. You know, Obviously we're all aware that Apple will launch something on device on AI at
Like
WWDC.
a week from
We
now.
are an on device AI company focused on the Mac. What do we do about that? How are we different? How are we better? Let's dig deep into that. Let's make sure we have a really solid answer to that. Let's also make sure we're solving the right problem here, right? Is it a net positive and net negative? By the way, it's amazing. It's a net positive for us. We're really excited about it. So I think having those sessions at least once a week where unfocused time to dig in is super important. And then I think inevitably when you're at a stage where you're building a company, there's always a fundraising season. I think it's important to be either on or off on fundraising and not to, be distracted by fundraising on a consistent basis.
Yep.
But I think if you're on, I think you need to have a dollar discipline around fundraising and be on and be talking to a lot of people and try to close it up as soon as possible. And, that's something we're doing right now with NAP is we're in the middle of the fundraising push.
Congrats. And do you find then, well, hopefully congrats, hopefully it closes well and get to where you want it to go. Do you find though that like you have to wear multiple hats as a founder? And like, how do those hats change over time as well? Right? Like, is it, sure, you're wearing your fundraising hat right now, but like, what are the other hats that you put on at different times? Or is it you're always in product mode as a founder? You're always in sales mode. Are those hats always part of what you're wearing?
I think the big shift comes when you're going from like 2 or 3 people to 10 people. And then again, when you're when you're going to 100 people, I think your role changes fairly significantly at that point. So what I'm referring to with Nap and Knapsack is, a stage where we're, 2 to 3 people right now. I think when you get to 10 people, you do have to realize that you are really primarily there to empower people to do great. I believe in the upside down org chart. So you should be there to empower people to get their shit done and do it well. And so at that point, you need to probably put aside trying to actively do everything and try to help people get their jobs done as much as possible. And so that ends up looking quite different. And then I think when you get to 100 people, you are still making a lot of decisions, guiding the strategic direction of the company. You're probably spending a lot of time fundraising and recruiting, just like you normally would, which I think are 2 core roles for a CEO. At the same time, I think you're really an example for setting the tone. You're setting the culture of the company, and you're probably spending more time doing that. And that's probably the most leveraged thing you will be doing at that point, because setting that tone ensures that you actually have the right people on board as you go from 100 to 1,000.
Yeah, totally, for sure. And then speaking quickly about, I want to just talk really quickly about kind of like work-life balance in a sense, or maybe work-life, like, what are the right things for you? Like as a founder who's done it multiple times, like you kind of have to be all in as a founder, in my mind, to be really good at this. How do you play that out with someone who has a family, who has a life? What does that look like? Or maybe you say like, look, my life is work and that's about it. Like what is that balance that you think is healthy or at least works for you?
Yeah, so Jensen gave this answer to the work-life balance question at Stripe sessions where he said, I've got no problem with work-life balance. First thing I think of when I wake up is work. Last thing I think about when I go to bed is work. And I'm very happy with it, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that works for him. Obviously, it's worked out great for him. I don't know if that carries well over to other people. I think it's important to have some sense of, I would say, seasons, for lack of a better word, right? Where I think you have sprints of intense work and then you make sure you take time for yourself. I do think for me, it's more about thinking hard about what gives me energy rather than just thinking about whether I'm spending time working or not working, right? So reflecting on what gives you energy and then actually spending time on things that give you energy. And if one thing that gives you energy is going off and mountain biking, make sure you spend time doing that because that's going to make you more successful at work.
Yeah.
And I think figuring that out is important for people because I've run across way too many people who thought this required working nonstop and they burnt out before they were even able to raise their Series A.
Yeah, no, I agree. And actually, I think maybe you and I are similar, maybe not. Tell me if this is the case, but for me, a lot of that kind of balance period is actually reading about a lot of tech related stuff and work related stuff. And so for me, they merge nicely together. Some things go really tangential. Some things are really focused on what I do, but that's to me, then gives me balance a little bit more. And so on that note, actually, two last questions. One is, you mentioned you love to read blogs, books, not as many books, but blogs, books, all these other things. Are there any recommendations you have for the listeners on stuff that like either blogs you like to constantly read or books that are just like, yeah, absolutely a must read?
That's a fantastic question. So I think in terms of books, I'm currently reading Outlive, which is a great book about,
Peter
a
Attia,
new.
right?
Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, I read it.
Okay, yeah, it's a fantastic book. Recommend it. Different approach on medicine. Great for just having a new approach to what I guess they call the marginal decade, right? Which is basically having a more longevity, but longevity on a more incremental basis and really practical things. I think it really made me think a little bit differently about Pronovio scans, and I think a company that you even recommended to me, which basically provides more metrics around your health. And so
Function
would
health.
highly recommend that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess in terms of blogs, I would recommend The Realistic Optimist, which is a blog about the rise of emerging markets. There's this interesting demographic phenomenon happening right now where the middle class in emerging markets each year is growing by more than the entire middle class of the US.
Yeah.
And it's a phenomenon that's happening sort of under our noses. We're a little bit insulated in a bubble here. We don't really realize it's happening. And that's happening at the same time as these people actually having access to the same digital tools we all have access to, and also money being digitized, knowledge being digitized, AI being available to these folks. And so I actually think, it's going to have a pretty dramatic effect on the next 20 to 30 years in terms of the way the world is organized. I think a lot of us have probably seen the projections about India being the largest economy in the world in the next 20 to 30 years based on the way things are going. I think we'll actually see a lot of socioeconomic change coming out of this change in economic power and the way the world is organized. I think startups in these emerging markets are going to play a huge role in actually shaping how that works. We've already seen that with Nubank and others, but I think that's just the first wave of a whole bunch of other people. And Timothy Mott, who writes that blog, has done a fantastic job of actually profiling companies who are on that trend.
Yeah. So my last question that I ask every single guest is, if you could boil all this down into one single piece of advice that you would give to an entrepreneur, the one thing you should try to do as an entrepreneur to achieve excellence, what would that one thing be?
Put yourself out there. You really have to, reflect obviously on what you want to do, but you have to go ahead and do it. And, it's one thing to think about doing something. Another thing is to actually try to do it. And you just have to put yourself out there. And I guess there's another version of put yourself out there, which is when you do have a team, be authentic to your team and let them know what's going on with you, which is very motivating for them.
Yeah. So sort of no fear plus honesty, I guess.
That's right. That's right.
And so, Mark, how can people find you? If they want to get in touch, how can people find you out there on the wilds of the internet?
Yeah, so on Threads and on Twitter and on LinkedIn, I'm on Mark Heynen, and that's where I currently spend most of my time. And yes, you're welcome to find me there and reach out to me anytime you want.
Amazing. Mark, thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it. I know our listeners will as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.